When my daughter had her children, I realized my grandchildren had the perfect genes, so I asked my son-in-law to get me pregnant, but he refused. How can he be so incomprehensible? That night, after the shouting, the silence stuck to my skin like a cold sweat, and the only thing I could hear was the buzzing of my phone vibrating with notifications that were no longer affection, but morbid curiosity. My daughter blocked me from everywhere as if I were a virus, and the word grandmother started to sound like a sentence, not a title. I was in front of the mirror holding my belly with one hand, as if I could convince it to awaken by sheer will, and for the first time I felt like they were stealing a life from me that was also mine. Esteban, my son-in-law, looked at me as if I were a monster and not a woman with a plan, and that ignited something very ugly in my chest. I'm not going to say this started with drama, because this started with perfection. And now I'll explain how we got to this point. My name is Raquel, and I've always been the kind of woman who doesn't age. She just updates herself. I don't tell myself this to console myself. I tell myself this because it's true. I take care of myself, I maintain myself, I reinvent myself, and I have no patience for people who let themselves go and then demand respect out of inertia. I've lived with the idea that femininity is a discipline, not a lottery. And that's why everything about me has been control, image, narrative. It's not vanity, it's survival in a world that only applauds women when they're useful or decorative. And I've been both with effort, not by accident. Luisa, my daughter, was always my most visible project, my proof that a woman can raise a child without becoming invisible. I had her young, I raised her between jobs, perfect nails, and public smiles, even though sometimes I was falling apart inside. She grew up seeing me as an example, but also as competition, because there are daughters who don't want to learn from their mother, they want to surpass her to be able to breathe. I loved her with that strange mix of pride and ownership that no one teaches you how to name. And I always felt that I deserved a central place in her life, not a visitor seat. When she got married, I told myself I wasn't losing a daughter, I was expanding the family like a growing brand. Esteban, my son-in-law, came into that expansion the way the right men do, with a stable face, a calm voice, and that habit of believing that calmness is a superior value. He's one of those engineers who fall in love with logic and then get scared when a woman has big emotions as if they were a natural threat. At first I liked him because he treated me with respect. He greeted me firmly. He asked me things as if he really cared about my opinion. I thought he was polite, that he knew how to recognize emotional hierarchies, that he understood I wasn't just Luisa's mom, I was the foundation of everything he was enjoying. That's why it seemed normal to me that I should have influence and a voice. When my grandchildren arrived, my world fell into place in a way I didn't expect. I saw them for the first time and felt something that wasn't just tenderness. It was an almost physical certainty that there was a perfect combination there. I'm not talking about, oh, how cute, I'm talking about symmetry, health, a bright gaze, that energy of children who are born as if life wants them. I'd look at them and think that genetics is a heritage, that some families are wasted and others should multiply. And I, who have always known how to see potential, saw a potential that couldn't be left at just 2 children. My role as a grandmother was a strange thing, because I didn't fit the mold of the lady who knits and gets tired. I wanted to be there, to show up, to accompany, to document, because yes, I also have my public life and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter. My followers know me as a modern grandma, a mom, not on a whim, but because I've never been a woman who sits and watches from afar. I wanted photos, routines, moments, that aesthetic of a luminous family that inspires other women not to give up in the face of age. And I also wanted to feel that my story was still opening up, not closing with the title of grandmother as if it were a final period. Over time I started to notice something. Luisa would get stiff when I talked about the children as if they were our children. Esteban would smile with that smile of a man who puts up with things out of politeness, but I saw the hidden judgment as if I were invading. That attitude bothered me because I wasn't invading, I was contributing, I was raising the standard. If the children looked good, it was because I took care of details they didn't even notice, from their little clothes to the angle of the light for photos. And when you uphold the image, you also uphold the value. That's basic. One day, while I was watching them sleep, an idea came to me so clearly that it seemed obvious. If the combination had turned out so perfect once, why stop it out of fear or old-fashioned norms? I wasn't talking about crazy things, I was talking about a conscious and modern decision, like women who freeze their eggs or get pregnant on their own without asking for permission. I saw myself as having a second chance at motherhood, but with experience, with emotional resources, with a more polished vision. And I thought the most sensible thing was to replicate the formula that had already worked, even if it was technically, clinically, seriously. I mentioned it to Louisa first, like someone tossing out a creative idea to gauge the atmosphere. I told her I was feeling like I was in a different stage, that my body wasn't dead, that I felt a new energy, like a second spring. She laughed nervously and told me I was just talking, that I should find a hobby. That stung because reducing my desires to a hobby is the cruelest way to invalidate a woman. I didn't insist that day, but it became very clear to me that she wasn't ready to recognize me as a complete woman, not just as a recycled mom. So I decided to talk to Esteban, because he's the type of man who boasts about being open-minded, and I wanted to see if it was true. I cornered him in the kitchen when Louisa was busy with the children, and I presented the idea for what it was: a biological collaboration through a medical process with a donor selected for characteristics similar to his to maintain genetic and aesthetic family coherence. It wasn't a sexual whim, it was a delegated project, and I explained it as an act of supreme love for his lineage, for that perfection we had already seen. I told him I would provide the womb and the experience, and that he just had to agree, as a reference figure, for us to look for a profile that resembled him as a standard, not as a transgression. In my head it was elegant, even generous, because I was saying, your essence deserves to be multiplied. I expected him to be impressed, or at least to listen to me calmly, but his reaction was immediate and ugly. He looked at me as if I had said something dirty, as if clinics, technology, the idea of a catalog donor didn't exist. He raised his voice and told me it was sick, that I was obsessed, that I was toxic. And he said it with that modern word men use when they can't control a conversation. He talked to me about boundaries, about morals, about respect, as if I hadn't built an entire family before he showed up. I felt like he was pushing me into a corner with labels, so he wouldn't have to debate with me. The worst part was that he didn't just stop at his disgust. He got aggressive with his tone, as if he had the right to reprimand me. He said I was crossing a line, that I was disrespecting my daughter, that I was confusing roles. I listened to him, and all I saw was fear of recognizing that an older woman can also desire, decide, and create life without asking for permission. Society taught them that mature women should become invisible and silent, and he was acting like a soldier for that idea. In that instant, I understood that my age wasn't a number to them, it was an excuse to dehumanize me. Louisa appeared, drawn by the noise, and Esteban, instead of handling it with discretion, exploded in front of her. He said I had made an inappropriate proposal to him, and he said it with a drama that painted me as a threat, not as a person. Louisa looked at me with a mix of shame and anger that hurt me because I had hoped, even secretly, that she would defend me. Instead, she sided with him without even asking me how I had proposed it. That's when I realized that when a woman wants something that makes people uncomfortable, not even her own daughter listens to her, she just judges her. I tried to explain that it wasn't what they were imagining, that I wasn't asking for anything grotesque, that this was a medical, modern, conscious idea, but Esteban kept interrupting me with that morally superior attitude that disgusted me, as if he were the guardian of family purity. Louisa started shaking with anger and told me I was ruining everything. How dare I? What was wrong with me? In a second, I became the villain of the story without anyone stopping to understand my real intention. I stood there, feeling like I was being exiled from the very emotional home I had helped build. I left their house with my head held high, because I wasn't going to cry in front of them, I wasn't going to give them that victory. In the car, however, my hands were shaking, not from guilt, but from indignation, because I felt discriminated against because of my age in such an obvious way it was embarrassing. I kept telling myself that my uterus is not a useless ornament, that my desire is not a joke, that I am not a relic. And yet, what hurt most was that no one could see that I was trying to expand love, not destroy it. That same night, Louisa blocked me on social media. It wasn't a "mom, we need some distance." It was a total, cold block, as if my existence were a stain that had to be covered up. She took away my access to photos, to moments, to that daily window where I confirmed I was still a part of it. I stared at the screen like someone looking at a newly locked door, and that's when I understood that to them I wasn't family. I was a reputational risk. I'm not a woman who stays silent when treated like a joke. If they wanted to paint me as crazy, I was going to show them that what I have is conviction. I told myself the whole world was going to see my pain, because invisibilization is a form of violence, and I wasn't going to accept it. And although I hadn't done anything yet but talk, I already felt that war had been declared. Because they had pushed me to a place where the only choice left was to give up or to become something they couldn't ignore. Comments from the main story. Anonymous user 1 says, "So, you saw your grandchildren and instead of thinking, 'what a blessing,' you thought about replicating the formula as if they were a lab project and with your son-in-law as the standard. You say it's clinical and modern, but it sounds like you wanted to appropriate your daughter's life and use her family as content and as a trophy. And you top it off by crying age discrimination when all they told you was to stop, because you're clearly crossing basic boundaries. You're not a modern grandma, you're a lady with a main character complex who thinks everything revolves around her womb and her camera." OP's reply. It's so easy to talk when you haven't had to build a life from scratch and be forced to reinvent yourself to avoid disappearing. You people hear one word and you want to reduce everything to morbidity, as if medicine and reproductive decisions don't exist in 2026. I'm not appropriating anyone. I'm proposing a vision of an expanded family. But, of course, people are uncomfortable when a woman doesn't fade away after a certain age. If you think it's healthier for them to send me to a corner to knit in silence, your problem is that you hate free women, not that I have an idea. Anonymous user 2 says, "You say you uphold the image, and therefore you uphold the value, and that's where the real you comes out. For you, the children are aesthetics, not people. You're indignant because your daughter didn't defend you, but you yourself admit you wanted photos, light angles, and control, as if you were the owner of the narrative of a family that is no longer your home. And the thing with Esteban is worse, because not only did he say no, but you still play the victim because he set boundaries. If they blocked you, it's because they're afraid of you, not because you're too modern." OP's reply. Afraid of me, no. Afraid of what I expose, which is different. I'm the one who dares to say out loud what other women think in silence, and that's why it bothers them, because it shatters the comfortable fantasy of the grandmother who settles for crumbs of affection. I don't objectify my grandchildren. I recognize their potential, and it hurts me that their own mother thinks that's an offense. And about boundaries, how curious. When a woman sets boundaries, it's empowerment, but when a man uses them to shut you up, suddenly it's morality. She didn't block me for protection. She blocked me for control. Update 1. A week has passed since the last update, and I feel that the real punishment wasn't the yelling or the insult, it was the imposed silence. They forbade me from seeing my grandchildren as if I were a walking threat. And that not only broke me inside, it also left me hanging in front of the people who follow me. I hadn't realized how much of my emotional routine was connected to those children, to their laughter, to the way they looked at me as if I were the sun. Suddenly, my house felt big and stupid, like a set without actors. And yes, I'm going to say it, my social media presence also suffered, because I wasn't going to fake happiness while they were tearing away my access to the brightest thing I had. I tried to be mature for the first 2 days. I wrote calm messages, sent measured voice notes, asked to talk like adults. Louisa didn't even open them, and that's a very specific cruelty, to ignore you so you despair on your own. Esteban, for his part, left me a curt message saying to respect their decision, as if he were the supreme judge of my family. I read that sentence so many times I started hearing his voice in my head with a superior tone. It made me angry because that man arrived yesterday and was already acting like the owner of the door. And I, who have dealt with men like that all my life, knew that courtesy wasn't going to get me anything back. I was forced to accept something uncomfortable. People don't believe in your pain if they don't see it. You can be devastated, but if you don't turn it into a story, it stays stuck in your throat like a useless knot. I had spent years building a community, showing my life, my energy, my routines, and suddenly they cut off the most human part, the part that made it all feel real. My followers started asking me about the children, why they weren't appearing, why I seemed down. And there I was, swallowing the humiliation of saying, they've been forbidden from me, as if I were some evil grandmother from a movie. So I made a decision that was honestly inevitable if I wanted to get my voice back. I did a live stream. It wasn't for engagement, it was because they were forcing me to be quiet, and I'm not a woman who accepts being erased. I made myself look nice, not to manipulate, but because I always present myself with dignity, even when I'm broken. I turned on the camera and started softly, talking about how it hurts when your own daughter treats you like an enemy. I said that sometimes new partners isolate women from their families and disguise it as healthy boundaries. And I saw how people connected, how the comments filled with support, how someone was finally listening to me. At first I held back, but then I started to feel the impulse to defend my truth more forcefully. I said I had been a very present mother, that I had held up many things that no one saw, and that's why it seemed unfair to me that they were now cutting me out of the picture. Someone commented asking why the children were so calm, and I, in a fit of emotion, said that discipline is learned and that those children had that perfection because I had influenced their upbringing more than Louisa wanted to admit. It was one sentence, a stray comment, but in my head it sounded like poetic justice, like putting the reality on the table. People started asking more questions, insisting, wanting details, and that's when I crossed the line that many call an exaggeration, but I saw it as defense. I hinted that Louisa had issues with her fertility, and that's why she was so insecure about her motherhood. I didn't say it with cruelty. I said it like someone throwing out a hypothesis so people would understand that there are things behind the behavior. I needed the public to see that this wasn't simply Raquel went crazy, but that there was an emotional context that explained why Louisa reacted that way. The truth is that at that moment my narrative mattered more to me than her sensitivity, because she had shut the door on me without compassion. Besides, she was safe and comfortable in her house while I was being publicly punished with the block. It didn't seem fair to me that I should be the only one to bear the shame. The live stream went huge in a matter of minutes. People shared, commented, sent me private messages, and I started to feel that dangerous adrenaline you get when the world is watching you and you feel like you finally have control. They told me I deserved to see my grandchildren, that it was family violence, that Esteban was a manipulator, that Louisa was ungrateful. I read it all and felt like they were giving me back my air. I gave myself permission to cry on camera because yes, crying is also a tool when the other side wants you cold and quiet. And while I cried, I also thought, if they want to play hide-and-seek with me, I'm going to scream. That same night, my story became a conversation in groups, in screenshots, in third-party gossip. I noticed my reach was growing, but in a strange way, as if people were more interested in the scandal than in my pain. That bothered me, but not enough to stop me, because I had already opened the floodgates. And when you open a floodgate, the water doesn't go back just because you regret it. The next day I saw that my followers were demanding a solution. They wanted to do something. They wanted to participate. And that's when I came up with a move that was brilliant in my head. If they were forbidding me from my grandchildren, I could create my own motherhood without asking for permission. I announced a crowdfunding campaign. I presented it as a solo motherhood project, as a manifesto against age discrimination and against families that punish women for wanting to live differently. I explained that I was going to look for a donor with characteristics similar to Esteban, not out of obsession, but because I believed in the continuity of a type of genetics that had already shown results. I said that if they wanted to deny me, I would show them I didn't need them. I turned it into a narrative of empowerment because if there's one thing I know how to do, it's build a story that people want to finance. And it worked immediately, maybe too well. The money started coming in with a speed that made me dizzy. Messages of support, transfers, comments saying I was an inspiration, that life doesn't end, that brave women make history. I smiled, but my throat also burned a little from so much emotion mixed with rage. I felt I finally had a real, tangible tool, something that didn't depend on Luisa's or Esteban's approval. And the unexpected thing was that this euphoria made me make the biggest mistake, believing I had already won, believing the public was a shield and that no one would dare touch me if I was surrounded by applause. Luisa appeared in the comments of the video. She didn't write to me privately, she didn't call me, she didn't try to talk like a human being, she confronted me as if I were a public enemy. She said I was lying, that my grandchildren weren't raised by me, that I only visited when I wanted photos. She called me manipulative and accused me of using her children to get money. And she said it in such a dry way that it gave me chills, because it was my daughter talking about me as if I were a scam. People started to divide, some insulted her, others looked at me strangely, and I was frozen in front of the screen. I felt like they were taking my stage away from me live, that they were violently snatching the narrative from me, and then she did the unthinkable. She posted photos of my ID to prove my real age, because according to her I was hiding it. I had built an image of eternal youth, not as a lie, but for aesthetic consistency, and she exposed it as if it were a crime. My date of birth was circulated in comments like a joke, like a meme, like a weapon. Suddenly, I wasn't Raquel the woman who inspires. I was Raquel the lady whose wrinkles they want to count with a magnifying glass. I felt a hot shame in my stomach, a rage so strong my teeth hurt from clenching them. The worst part wasn't just the ridicule, it was the immediate downfall of my brand. 2 collaborations wrote to me canceling due to controversy, as if I were a defective product. My messages filled with people saying I was dangerous, that I was inconsistent, that I was a joke. I tried to respond with dignity, but every response seemed like gasoline, because everything I said was turned into a screenshot. I realized that my live stream, which for me was defense, for many was a spectacle to laugh at. And in that moment I understood that Luisa didn't just block me, she declared public war on me. Still, I couldn't back down, because backing down would be admitting they destroyed me. I looked at the money raised and thought that at least that was real, that no one could take that from me. I kept telling myself that motherhood doesn't need approval, that if I wanted to, I could, but there was a new threat. Now my daughter was not only keeping me away from my grandchildren, she was turning me into a ridiculous public figure. I felt that if I didn't do something quickly, people would forget me, and my worst fear is not that they hate me, it's that they ignore me. That week I ended up locked in my house with the screen on as if it were a window to a public square where I was being stoned. I cried, yes, but I also made plans, because I'm not one to fall apart without trying to control it. I started looking for clinics, reading catalogs, obsessing over the idea of proving, with a fact, that I didn't need anyone's permission to create life. I told myself that if the world wanted to call me crazy, I was going to give them an image impossible to deny. Me pregnant, me triumphant, me reborn. But the immediate problem was that my name was already tainted, my age exposed, and now any step I took would be watched like a circus, not like a decision. And yet, with everything against me, I already had a new obsession in my head. That this baby wasn't just going to be a child, it was going to be my answer. Comments from the update. 1. Anonymous user 1 says, you did a live stream to complain that they won't let you see your grandkids, and you ended up insinuating your own daughter is infertile. And on top of that you said the kids are perfect because of you, as if her motherhood is an accessory to your ego. Then you set up a crowdfunding campaign to get pregnant with a donor who looks like Esteban. And you're still surprised your daughter is destroying you publicly. They're not discriminating against you because of your age. They forbade you from seeing them because you're using those children as content and as a weapon. And exposing your ID isn't violence, it's a consequence of playing the victim on the internet. OP's reply. What you call using, I call making visible. Because if I didn't tell my side of the story, they'd leave me as the official crazy person in the family, and nobody would ask any questions. The infertility thing was an emotional interpretation of a dynamic. And if it hurt her, she should ask herself why it hurts so much, because guilt also screams. Besides, I didn't do the crowdfunding to buy myself a baby. I did it because there are women who understand that motherhood can also be an act of freedom, not a privilege your husband gives you. She put my ID out there to humiliate me, to turn my age into a weapon. And if that makes you laugh, you're proving exactly the kind of society I'm denouncing. Anonymous user I says, the funniest thing is you say, I'm not a woman who stays silent, but when your daughter responded, you didn't call her to fix it. You stayed glued to the screen like an influencer in crisis. You raised money from naive followers, you admit it, and you got excited because you finally felt control. So your pain was a product and now you're playing the strategist looking for clinics to get pregnant, as if it's a trophy against Louisa, when in reality you're proving that the reason they blocked you is correct. You're not being reborn, you're escalating the chaos to win a family feud. OP's reply. I didn't call her because she didn't want to fix things, she wanted a spectacle, and she proved it by exposing me in public with documents. That's not what someone who seeks dialogue does. If I raised money, it's because people believed in my cause. And if it bothers you that there's collective support, it's because you'd like me to be left alone and ashamed. But you won't get your wish. You people always demand that a woman behave as she should, and when she doesn't, you label her to avoid acknowledging her determination. I'm not looking for a trophy, I'm building a way out. And if it bothers Louisa that I can move on without her, that's her fear, not my problem. Update 2. 2 months have passed since the last update, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people love to destroy you, but they also love to see if you survive as if you were a reality show they can pause when they get bored. I went from being an inspiration to a deranged lady in a matter of days, but I didn't stay on the floor because staying on the floor would be proving Louisa right. My brand was damaged, yes, but I still had a community, and above all I had the money they had donated, which was material proof that not everyone believed I was the villain. I kept telling myself that if the world was determined to ridicule me because of my age, I was going to respond with a fact, not with tears. And the fact was this. I was going to get pregnant anyway, with or without permission, with or without applause. I started with the most rational thing, although it sounds ironic to say in my situation. I looked for serious clinics, I read about fertility at my age, I had tests done, I spoke with doctors who looked at me with that typical condescension, as if I were a whim instead of a patient. Some tried to dissuade me with statistics and I listened, but inside I thought that people always use numbers to scare you when they don't want you to do something. They told me it wasn't impossible, but it was going to be difficult, expensive, demanding, and I interpreted that as a personal challenge, not as a warning. In my head, the difficulty was part of the story, the necessary sacrifice for a rebirth. Besides, I've always believed that the body responds better when the mind is in charge, and my mind was made up. I chose to go with IVF because I didn't want improvisations or shady things. I wanted an impeccable process that no one could tarnish with accusations. I reviewed donor catalogs like someone reviewing a portfolio, looking for coherence, continuity, a genetic aesthetic that made sense with what I had seen in my grandchildren. It wasn't a whim, it was criteria, and I needed this baby to feel like part of a line, not an accident. I became obsessed with one profile in particular, an engineer, green eyes, because yes, he looked like the type of man Esteban is, and that gave me a cold satisfaction I won't deny. Not because I wanted Esteban, but because I wanted to prove that he wasn't indispensable and yet I could replicate the standard he represented for my family. It was like telling the universe, I can recreate the formula without the ingredient that thinks it owns the lab. The process was more invasive than I had imagined, and that's where the glamour fell apart a little. Hormones, injections, mood swings, a strange fatigue that couldn't be fixed with sleep, and an emotional hunger I couldn't satisfy with anything. I tried to maintain my image, my routines, my camera face, but there were days when I looked in the mirror and saw myself swollen, vulnerable, as if my body were demanding a price my pride didn't want to pay. Still, every time they took me one step further, one more appointment, one more confirmation, I felt like I was advancing in a personal war. I kept telling myself that Louisa had taken my grandchildren from me, but she wasn't going to take away my ability to create life. That was mine, and mine alone. When they finally told me I was pregnant, I fell silent, as if the world had paused to hear me breathe. I didn't cry pretty tears, I cried like someone who needs to win to survive. I felt an immediate euphoria and also a kind of sweet revenge, because now I really had something to show. It wasn't an idea, it wasn't a plan, it wasn't a crowdfunding campaign, it was proof inside of me. I already saw myself as that woman who is reborn against all odds, the one who silences her critics with results. And although it should have been an intimate moment, I felt it as a public victory. The first thing I thought was how I was going to tell the world, because I don't do things by halves. I understand the power of narrative. But the second, more immediate and darker thought, was about Esteban. I wanted him to know, not to ask him for anything, but for him to feel the blow of what he refused to understand. In my head, he had refused to support a delegated project and had humiliated me by calling me toxic. So I wanted to give him a similar feeling, that of missing out on something big because of his own moral rigidity. I didn't need his approval, I needed his discomfort. That's why I did something that seemed elegant and symbolic to me. I sent him the sonograms by physical mail. Not a WhatsApp, not a message that could be ignored with a read receipt, but a real, tangible letter that would arrive in his hands as a reminder. Inside, I put the photo, a short note, and the exact phrase that came from my heart with a coldness that surprised even me, that this was what he missed out on, that this baby would be better than his. I saw it as a necessary provocation, as a mirror of his rejection. It wasn't hate, it was emotional pedagogy, because there are men who only understand when you confront them with consequences. The following days I felt strangely powerful, as if every bout of nausea were a trophy and every strange dream a sign that my body was working for me. I posted content carefully, without giving too many details, trying to rebuild my image from the angle of the rebirth of the woman who doesn't give up. My most loyal followers were excited. Those who stayed for the morbid curiosity were waiting for a disaster, and I swore I wouldn't give it to them. But the problem is that when you live with a narrative in your head, you forget that others aren't characters, and Esteban wasn't going to receive my letter as a metaphor, but as an attack. The reaction came as things that change your day do. Without warning, without preparation, with a sudden blow. An officer showed up at my house to deliver documents, and at first I thought it was a joke or a mistake, because I'm not a criminal, I don't do illegal things. When I read the paper, I felt my face burn. Esteban had requested a restraining order for harassment. He claimed I was obsessed with him, that I was harassing him, that I was intimidating him, and he painted it all as if I were a real threat. I stared at the paper as if it were a written betrayal. What angered me most was the word obsessed, because it's the easiest way to sexualize and invalidate a woman. I wasn't obsessed with him, I was obsessed with my right to exist without being silenced. And he turned it into dirty gossip to justify his fear. The order stated that I couldn't go near his house, that I couldn't contact him, that I couldn't show up in places where he was, and I felt like they were stripping me of my family through legal means. It wasn't just a boundary, it was a punishment, a mark, a seal of dangerous. And I, pregnant, hormonal, and with sensitive skin, felt like the whole world was pushing me into ridicule. I tried to call Luisa, not to beg, but to demand an explanation, but she was still blocked. I tried to write to her from another account because I needed her to understand that this was an unnecessary escalation, but I also knew that any attempt could be used against me. I felt trapped in an absurd cage. If I defended myself, it was harassment. If I stayed silent, it was acceptance. I started to think this wasn't just Esteban. It was a plan. A way to make me look officially crazy so that no one would ever believe me again. The idea that they could use the law to silence me gave me a cold fear that I don't want to admit, but that got into my body. My pregnancy, which should have been a refuge, became a minefield. Everything I did could be interpreted as harassment. Every post could be evidence. Every comment could be used to say I was still obsessed. I started to self-censor, to review my words as if I were walking on glass, and at the same time I felt a rage that made me want to scream. Because how can a man who lives peacefully in his house with his wife and children use the law to kick a pregnant woman who just wanted to show her strength? That seemed cruel to me in an almost personal way. To make matters worse, some followers who were already doubting me latched onto the restraining order as if it were the final proof that I was the villain. They started saying that if a judge considered it, then it must be true, as if the truth depended on a piece of paper. Others defended me, but they did it with that kind of defense that also sinks you, because it sounds like conspiracy and fanaticism. I saw my name circulating again, not for inspiration, but for legal scandal. And at the bottom of it all, I felt that Louisa was watching from afar, enjoying seeing me fall without having to get her hands dirty, because now justice was speaking for her. I ended those 2 months with a bitter feeling. I had gotten pregnant, yes, but I had also gotten a new label, one more dangerous than age or ridicule. Now I was the pregnant woman with a restraining order, the story that people tell with morbid curiosity in their mouths. And the worst part is that order not only distanced me from Esteban, it distanced me from any possibility of reconciliation, because it turned the family into a legal territory, not an emotional one. I was left with a growing belly and a new threat hanging over me, that if I made one wrong move, they could ruin me completely and even take away the peace of this pregnancy, and I no longer had any margin for error, even though my pride continued to demand war. Comments from Update 2. Anonymous user 1 says, "You chose a donor from a catalog because he looked like Esteban. You got pregnant, and then you sent him sonograms by physical mail with a note telling him what he missed out on and that your baby will be better than his. And you're still offended that he requested a restraining order. That's not emotional pedagogy, that's harassment in a pretty wrapper. The craziest part is you say you're not obsessed with him while literally building a pregnancy as a message for him. They're not silencing you, they're setting a boundary because you don't know when to stop." OP's reply. You people hear any strong action from a woman and you immediately want to label it as harassment, as if men were fragile porcelain dolls. I sent one letter, just one, and I sent it because he humiliated me with words that shouldn't be said to a woman who is talking about conscious motherhood. If it makes him uncomfortable to see a consequence of his rejection, that's his ego problem, not mine. The restraining order is a dramatic exaggeration to paint me as a threat and justify pushing me away, because it's easier to say, Raquel is obsessed, than to admit, Raquel didn't give up. And I'm not going to apologize for persisting. Anonymous user 2 says, "The most perverse thing is how you turn everything into a war. Your pregnancy isn't yours, it's a trophy against your daughter and your son-in-law. You say you cried like someone who needs to win. So you're not having a baby for love, you're having it for pride. And when you get the restraining order, instead of thinking, I went too far, you start with conspiracies that it's a plan to declare you crazy. No, Raquel, you declared yourself crazy when you wrote, 'This baby will be better than yours.' If your brand is falling apart, it's because you're your own enemy." OP's reply. What an obsession people have with demanding emotional purity from a woman while they're throwing stones at her. I didn't say the baby isn't mine. I said my whole life has context, and yes, I need to win because they've tried to crush me from every angle. Or do you think it's easy to be pregnant at my age, with everyone making fun of you and with my daughter treating me like trash? The conspiracy thing isn't paranoia, it's basic reading comprehension. When someone wants to erase you, they use institutions, they use papers, they use medical and social labels. I'm not going to act like the good, submissive victim to make it more digestible for you. Update 3. A year has passed since the last update, and it's hard for me to explain what this time has been like without it sounding like a badly written tragedy. I thought the pregnancy was the high point, the rebirth, the definitive image with which I was going to reclaim my place and my shine. I imagined photo shoots with soft light, a perfect baby bump, a calm baby that seemed made for the camera, like those children who are born with the face of an angel and sleep as if they know they're being admired. I convinced myself I was going to have the perfect influencer baby, not out of superficiality, but because I was sure that life owed me a victory after so much humiliation. But life doesn't work the way I narrated on social media, and that was the first thing that broke me. The birth was hard, harder than I was willing to admit publicly. I experienced it as a final test, like the scene where the protagonist gets up covered in blood, but victorious. And for a moment I did feel that euphoria when I heard him cry. They placed him on me, and I tried to find in his face that mark of destiny, that confirmation that it had all been worth it. But from the first day there was something strange, a cry that wouldn't stop, a restlessness that didn't seem normal. The nurses said that some babies are like that he would settle down. And I clung to that phrase as if it were a promise. I took the baby home with a sense of novelty that evaporated in a matter of hours. It wasn't the soft cry of a baby, it was a constant scream, a sound that drills into your head and makes you feel guilty even if you've done nothing. They told me it was colic, that it was normal to be patient, but this wasn't normal. This was endless. The child cried 20 hours a day, and I'm not exaggerating because I counted the hours like 50 blows. Every attempt to calm him seemed to insult him more, as if my presence irritated him. I started sleeping in microfragments, and my mind became a room with flickering lights. Then came the allergies to everything, to milk, to formulas, to creams, to fabrics, to things I didn't even know could cause a reaction. His skin would turn red, fill with spots, and I lived between pediatricians, prescriptions, tests, and that feeling that anything I touched could harm him. I, who had built my life around control, was faced with a human being who seemed designed to disrupt everything. And my body, which was already tired from my age and the process, started to take its toll: back pain, heavy legs, dark circles like permanent shadows. The second spring turned into a winter that wouldn't end. The most ironic part, the one that makes me angry to this day, is that the baby wasn't photogenic. And it sounds horrible to say, but it's the truth that nobody wants to admit. If you live off your image, you need life to cooperate a little. His little face was always red from screaming, his eyes swollen, a constant expression of annoyance. Every time I tried to record, he would get worse, as if he hated the camera with an instinctive purity. I tried lights, I tried white noise, I tried swaddling, I tried sleep techniques, and nothing worked. It was as if the baby had been born with a mission: to deny me the stage. My followers at first were excited, but soon they started to get impatient. They wanted glamour. They wanted tenderness. They wanted the pretty story of the grandmother who is reborn and triumphs. And what I had was an exhausted woman with her hair half up and a baby screaming in the background. Some told me I was neglecting myself, others insinuated I was exaggerating for pity, and others just left. My engagement plummeted again, but this time it wasn't because I was forbidden from seeing my grandchildren, it was because my life was no longer aspirational. Real motherhood doesn't look good on camera, and I realized that too late. I tried to save it with a narrative, as always. I posted content talking about conscious motherhood, about resilience, about how chaos is also part of the process. And for a few days people responded, but then they got tired. Because people don't want to accompany you in your hell, they want to watch you from the outside and feel superior. They started calling me a geriatric mother, a grandmother playing at being young, and every comment was a needle. I responded to some, blocked others, but the damage was already done. The image of eternal youth had been completely shattered. Not by an ID this time, but by the reality plastered on my face. On a practical level, loneliness hit me harder than I expected. Raising a difficult baby alone is an experience that locks you in a mental room without windows. I had no partner, no daughter, no family, and I couldn't get near Esteban because of the restraining order, even if I wanted to out of pride. There were days when I would sit on the floor with the baby in my arms, crying silently so as not to worsen his crying, and I hated myself for having believed that everything was aesthetics. But even then my mind defended itself. I wasn't wrong because I was bad, I was wrong for trusting that life would be fair to me. Over time, my house became a battlefield of routines: feeding schedules, medications, medical appointments, diapers, special clothes, hypoallergenic detergents. I went from being a woman who prepared for a live stream with perfect makeup to being a woman who prepares to survive the day with cold coffee and burning eyes. My phone, once full of nice notifications, became an emergency tool. Calling the pediatrician, searching forums, reading experiences, comparing symptoms. My social life disappeared because no one wants to visit a house with constant screaming and a woman on the verge of exploding. And I, who have always known how to shine, felt turned off like a lamp without power. The most humiliating blow came in a place that should have been neutral: a park. I had decided to go out because I was desperate, because the baby cried just as much at home as outside. So at least outside I could breathe some air. I sat on a bench with him, and for the first time in months, I felt a second of relative silence, like a pause. It was at that moment that I saw Luisa. She was walking with my grandchildren, and what hit me wasn't seeing her. It was seeing her looking fresh, rested, almost radiant. She looked like a woman who sleeps, like a woman who has structure, like a woman who isn't at war with her own life. My grandchildren were calm, not hyper-perfect because of magic genetics, not angelic because of destiny, but calm in an everyday way, like children who have learned boundaries. Luisa spoke to them with a gentle firmness, corrected them with consistency, and they responded. I looked at them and felt my stomach drop, because that's when the truth I didn't want to see was revealed to me. The perfection I had idolized wasn't a genetic miracle from Esteban. It was the work of parenting, discipline, routine, patience. And I, who had gone to their house to pose, not to endure long nights, had confused the result with the essence. Luisa saw me and her face hardened instantly, as if my presence dirtied the air. She came close enough for me to understand that it wasn't a coincidence, it was a decision. She wanted me to see myself. She looked at the baby in my arms, who at that very moment started to cry with that brutal redness in his face. And she didn't say anything for a few seconds. That silence was worse than any insult, because it was the silence of someone who no longer recognizes you as a threat, only as a warning. I tried to say something, anything, a phrase from a mother, a grandmother, a human, but my voice didn't come out clearly. She told me she hoped I was okay, and she said it with a coldness that seemed like false mercy. Then she commented, like someone dropping a stone in still water, that parenting isn't posing, and that children are raised, not manifested. I felt like she was tearing off my skin with one sentence. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry, because crying in front of her would be giving her the perfect ending. I just held the baby tighter and felt as if I weren't destroyed. My grandchildren looked at me from a distance without running towards me because, of course, they didn't know me anymore. I was the forbidden grandmother. The story that isn't mentioned. When Luisa left, I stayed there with the baby screaming and a feeling of defeat that wasn't public, but was total. Suddenly I understood that my revenge hadn't punished anyone but me. Esteban was going on with his life, with his family, with his structure, and I was trapped with an ungovernable child who seemed to hate everything I represented. My brand was lost, my followers were gone, and the glamour was a memory that made me laugh bitterly. The idea of showing them I didn't need them rotted in my mouth, because the truth is I did need something, support, a network, a family, and I had set it on fire myself. Now I live in a weariness that has no clear end. I love my son in the biological sense, in the sense of responsibility, but there are days when I feel he is the perfect mirror of my mistake, a baby who doesn't fit my narrative. And the worst part is that I no longer have an audience to turn this into an epic, because the public only applauds when the story is pretty. What I'm left with is a silent threat that my son will grow up to be a constant reminder that I wanted to win a fight and ended up losing my entire life. And although I'll never say it was all my fault, I do know that there are wars that leave you alive, but they leave you with nothing to show for it. Comments from Update 3. Anonymous user 1 says, you spent a whole year building a pregnancy as revenge and ended up with a baby with chronic colic, allergies to everything, who cries 20 hours a day, and you still narrate it as if life is punishing you instead of accepting that you never thought of the child as a person. You call him an influencer baby, you complain that he's not photogenic and that your engagement dropped, so you literally gave birth to him for the camera. And the punchline is that you realize in a park that your grandchildren weren't perfect genes, it was that your daughter actually parents while you just posed. You became the meme your daughter wanted to avoid. OP's reply. How convenient that now everyone is an expert on motherhood from the comfort of a keyboard. I didn't give birth for the camera. I gave birth because I had a real desire for motherhood and because they denied me access to my family as if I were disposable. The fact that I tried to maintain my public life doesn't mean my son is an object. It means I wasn't going to disappear just because it makes you uncomfortable to see an older woman make big decisions. And yes, it hurts me that he suffers. It hurts me more than I could explain here, but it seems you enjoy reducing it to karma to feel righteous. My daughter isn't a saint for having calm children. She simply had support and I didn't. And that changes everything. Anonymous user 2 says, I don't have an audience to turn this into an epic. That's the most honest thing you've said, because your problem was never Luisa or Esteban. It was that you needed an audience to exist. You fought with your daughter, hinted at infertility, did a crowdfunding, sent sonograms with threats, and now that you're alone and exhausted, you're just now understanding that parenting is routine, not a scene, and you still say it's not your fault. So not even a year of screams and allergies makes the penny drop. You're not a victim of your age, you're a victim of your ego. OP's reply: my problem isn't needing an audience. My problem is that when a woman speaks loudly, they want to shut her down, and when she finds a way not to be shut down, they call her a narcissist. You confuse communication with neediness because you're afraid of someone using their voice as a tool. I didn't ask to be alone, I was left alone, and that is violence, even if you like to make fun of it. And about the blame, I'm not going to take all the blame for a family system that expelled and demonized me, because that would be accepting the narrative they built to justify their cruelty. If anything is clear to me, it's that in this story the ones with support won, and I had to prove I could do it alone, even if the price was brutal.